Cthulhu in the Deep South. By Kirk Battle. Read by Toby Nelson. Chapter 1.
December 11th, 1861. Dear sister, by now you will have heard the dreadful news of what has happened in Charleston. If they ever find me among the ashes, my mystery will be no more revealed than one might count the grains of sand on the beach. I have dreamt of things you cannot fathom, and walked in places where no woman has dared. I cannot explain it briefly to you. If you do not have time to read my whole account, then heed this warning. Do not trust the dream walker. He is a liar and a deceiver, no matter what form he may wear. If you are thinking back on the past few years and wonder to what I refer, then you should know I was forced to disguise my letters. We last spoke in person at my wedding to Clarence. Those shining halcyon days seem so far away now. I can recall the flowers from the wedding party. White daffodils and yellow crocuses so bright they matched the sun. Clarence's mother insisted I hang that ghastly green drapery arrangement as a centerpiece for the wedding party, but by God I got my flowers. It was the only thing Gertrude Armitage ever let me have. You and Father were there, of course, and Mother had just begun to have that cough. Arkham was so beautiful in its autumn splendor. I remember watching the dark red leaves of the sugar maple fall outside our house and crying, knowing it would be the last time I ever saw it. You never did understand the attraction. Clarence first arrived in Arkham with the cotton merchants plying their wares on Yankee textile mills. Father had quite a few strong words to say about my spending time with a slaver, what with Mother being an abolitionist. You may recollect how I asked them about attending Miskatonic University, and they refused on account of my sex? Perhaps it all began as the simple desire to show them that I did not need their approval. What I liked was that everything was going to be new with him. My future husband was full of promises about the great mansions and the singing slaves whom I could dote on. He said I was going to be his conscience, and I suppose that will prove true after a fashion. His family had a most scandalous history, what with his uncle disappearing after that slave massacre in 1837. After the lawyers got done sorting out the mess his uncle made by signing all those banknotes and checks, all Clarence's family could salvage was the land and slaves. This lasted until I met Gertrude. It started between my mother-in-law and me before I ever set foot in the Deep South. The wedding celebration was just the beginning of our feud. You recall how in my letters I explained that I was having a wonderful time on my honeymoon. It wasn't true. Gertrude ruined every opportunity she could. She refused to travel alone, and so accompanied us for the first part of our journey, before meeting with a cousin who would accompany her. When Clarence took me to Niagara Falls, Gertrude refused to leave the carriage. All I wanted to do was walk around the falls and see the sights, but she would have nothing to do with it. Clarence got so upset he stayed behind while I had to walk alone. Every meal she was critical of how I ate, and especially how I treated the servants. "It is all well and good to behave this way around an Irish or German girl," Gertrude would say, "but you cannot speak so freely around a slave. They will repeat every word you utter. Honestly, how you will ever manage in the South I do not know." Clarence always told me that being the mistress of a plantation would be a grand affair of balls and promenading in luxurious gardens, but Gertrude made sure I understood that it was a much more sordid business. My mother-in-law had been raised to run a plantation from birth, and firmly believed it was the duty of a planter's wife to manage a household efficiently and courteously. She always used that phrase, efficiently and courteously. I could mime the words so well that sometimes I could make Clarence laugh when I did it, before Gertrude would turn around and ask what was going on. This was before she began to turn everyone against me. I had to beg for every moment alone with my husband. Every time I did, there was this terrible glint in Gertrude's eye, followed by a deplorable grin that made me think of those fish heads we used to throw rocks at when we were little girls. She may not have liked me, but she still wanted her herd to grow. Finally, Gertrude declared that she would begin furnishing our new home in the city of Charleston, while Clarence and I pursued our whimsical honeymoon. When I realized she would be chanting efficiently and courteously the whole time I selected furniture, I decided to choose my battles. Gertrude took a ship back to Charleston with her cousin to begin decorating the house, while Clarence bought us a train ticket to the West. The letter about my pregnancy coming soon after was true, as was how often I talked about Clarence's sweet nature, and that he was treating me wonderfully. When it was just the two of us, things were perfect. He had such a kindness in him once his horrid mother was gone that I wondered if he might be two people in one body. We only traveled far enough by train for the mountains to give way to endless seas of green grass before I was with child. We decided it would be best for me to convalesce back in Charleston. I did speak to a doctor who warned me about the diseases native to Charleston. Yellow fever, cholera, not to mention whatever the sailors brought in from Jamaica and Barbados. The doctor said the hot summer air became toxic, with all manner of nauseating things, but Clarence assured me I would be perfectly fine. I was getting to a point where I could no longer travel then, and he had political meetings to attend about the upcoming election. We followed the same path as Gertrude, traveling down the coast in a merchant vessel loaded with ice and produce. I think I sent you a postcard about the voyage. There were fresh apples from the previous fall's harvest preserved wonderfully in the cold cargo. It was quite a marvel to be eating apples in May. Clarence received a telegram from his mother that warned Charleston would be completely empty of anyone of real class when we arrived because of the summer season. People vacationed in the mountains or the sea islands, where a good strong breeze kept the noxious air flowing and, most importantly, the mosquitoes at bay. As a result of the season, Clarence decided I would have to convalesce at Ryland, an island he had inherited from that strange uncle. Oh, what I would give to know then what I know now. I can even remember the sad look in his eyes as he told me. The strange assurance that he would visit me as often as possible, but that his political work would call him into the city and surrounding countryside. I would be stranded on the little island with only a few slaves for company. I should perhaps explain the political situation in more detail so that you do not think too harshly of Clarence for abandoning me. I know you are well aware of Mr. Lincoln now, but this was in the summer of 1860. What little bit of politics I picked up from listening to Father was that the Democrats were split over how much they wanted to support slavery, while Lincoln was standing up and declaring enough was enough. Kansas is bleeding, they all kept saying. We have to stop the spread of slavery to the other states. That was how the slogans went in Arkham. No one really believed Lincoln would win. They just assumed the Democrats would stop their bickering and things would go back to normal. Clarence was an ardent secessionist, and he was trying to salvage the Democratic Party. On the subject of slavery, I always wrote very little to you, and for good reason. With Clarence and his mother, they were apoplectic if the question of the curious institution was even raised. You could not voice the slightest criticism about slavery around them without being on the receiving end of a heated barrage. I didn't dare bring my copy of Uncle Tom's Cabin with me, but even that was not enough. They were always suggesting articles to me that claimed slavery was God's will or that it was a positive good for civilization. It was all nonsense to me. What could be less Christian than enslaving another person? For them, the notion of some drunkard in Washington trying to tell them how to manage their slaves was patently absurd. If the federal government was not going to leave them alone, then why should they partake in it? The way in which they refused to listen to anyone or anything that disagreed with their views baffled me. And so, that was the condition in which I arrived in Charleston in July of 1860. It was unspeakably hot. One did not stop perspiring even at night, and the mosquitoes seemed able to find you no matter what you wore. It was impossible to go inside and leave the windows closed because of the heat, and it was impossible to leave them open because of those nasty insects. The streets were all sand, and true to Gertrude's warning, most of the families of any note were away for the summer. The city mostly seemed to be filled with slaves and free Negroes, daring to work and live where others feared the diseased air. I was there only a day before Gertrude insisted I be taken over to Ryland, where the summer home was almost finished. I did not disagree. The following day, my belly now quite noticeable, and my dress let out so that it billowed in the wind, I was rowed over to the twin islands of Ryland and Carcosa. We were rowed by a slave named Gideon, who seemed very young, but had a sure hand and a strong back. He loaded up all my luggage without any problem and arranged it neatly on the boat. A small bag of belongings was placed on top, and this proved to belong to Bila. She was an experienced wet nurse, and she was charged with my care for the remaining months of my pregnancy. Ryland was a sizable enough island. All the jungle had been cleared out for farmland after the uncle disappeared. The neighboring island, Carcosa, used to be where most of the cotton was grown until it mysteriously sank a few feet into the ocean. Clarence said it was most unusual for an island to sink, but there must have been some logical explanation. Tall reeds and patches of grass grew where the island once sat, so that it looked like an ocean of brown and green floating on top of the sea. Gideon told me he once rowed out there looking for oysters, and that you could still stand on the bottom in most parts. He said the place gave him a bad feeling, and that no slave would go near there at night for fear of ghosts that would snatch you away. I laughed at this, but he kept insisting it was true. Besides the grass, the only other notable thing about Carcosa was an enormous oak tree growing from the center of the island. It towered above everything like some black monolith, defying nature because how could a tree survive like that? Bila said that years ago there was an uprising and the old manor house was burned, so that the men of Charleston came and hanged all the Negroes on the island. Rumors began to spread of a revolt throughout South Carolina. Riders went out and rounded up every slave and free Negro they considered to be a bad element, then whipped them horribly. The fear lasted for years, and Charleston changed all its laws for slaves after that, introducing strict punishments and fines for any slave caught after curfew without a pass. The first few days on the island were not too harsh, since Gertrude was not yet with us. Ryland always had a steady breeze, so it was quite cool despite the sun, and the mosquitoes only got bad at sunset. Bila and I would sew and talk for hours while Gideon fished and rode supplies over from Charleston. Clarence would marvel that I could remain with only the slaves for so long, and despite my protests, he eventually brought Gertrude over to keep me company. My mother-in-law's presence was always a tedious affair, because she would only sit in the parlor and complain. She said I was too soft on the two slaves keeping Ryland, and that this convalescence was meant to be a training experience. She would boss Bila and Gideon around so crudely, pointing out the smallest flaw in their work, and there was nothing I could do but remain silent unless I wanted her cold scrutiny turned on me. Meanwhile, I was growing more pregnant every day. Oh, look at me. I've written pages of rambling, but I've barely begun to explain what has happened. How much you must already worry about me. The truth is that I have a very difficult time remembering anything clearly before the dreaming began. It started during one of Gertrude's visits. Bila was making oyster stew for supper, while Gertrude insisted she watch her every move in the kitchen. After a time, Gertrude complained Bila did not know a thing about making a proper stew and began cooking it herself. Sherry, onion grass, milk, all these things were stirred into the pot while Gideon shucked oysters. I was made to sit and watch, but I confess my gaze wandered. The sun was setting, and I had not worn a sunbonnet that day because the wind kept me cool. I remembered the blue skies darkening, and how the great oak of Carcosa seemed to spread ever larger across the sinking red sunset. After dinner that night, I grew terribly sick, and my stomach convulsed as if Gertrude herself was reaching inside me and clawing at my innards. The baby. Oh, my poor sweet child. It tried to fight as best it could. Bila put a cloth dipped in cool water on my forehead and sat by my bed that night as my illness turned worse. Visions began to come while I screamed long into the night. Twice, Gideon had to hold me down because of my thrashing. When sleep finally came, it brought my first true dream. I saw Carcosa. Not the shallow sea of reeds it is today, but a full island with rows of cotton and slave cabins dotting the plots. The sky was red and yet full of strange stars from a foreign land. In the center was the great oak. Branches spread like spider webs, so high into the sky it reached into the stars themselves. I was drawn to that tree. I could feel it calling out to me. I walked through the cotton rows until I reached the tree and put my hand out. When I touched it, I sensed something deep inside which was icy cold and pulsing. Then a voice whispered my name, Camilla. When I awoke in the morning, I had lost the baby.
Cthulhu in the Deep South by Kirk Battle. Read by Toby Nelson. Chapter 2.
I can still remember the red as the room came into focus. It was on my bedclothes, the sheets. It was in the bloody handprints on the wall. Bila was asleep in the rocking chair by the bed, and as my mind focused, the red faded into clean sheets and a simple nightgown. I knew that the child was gone, but I put my hands on my belly anyways. The little body was absent, replaced with a void where my child should have been. I began weeping as I realized that I was trapped in this horrible place forever. I longed for Clarence to hold me in his arms, to comfort me, to tell me this world was safe and cozy instead of this grim, windswept world in which I resided. "Mrs., I'm so sorry for you," said Bila, stirring from her own slumber. "You've been asleep some days now. We buried the baby round back, if you want to see." I tried to stand up, but Bila had to assist me. There was a bucket of water, and I washed before putting on fresh clothes. Downstairs, Gertrude was knitting in the parlor, and when she saw that I was on my feet, she had only a grim look for me. There were piles of newspaper all around with news of the election race between Lincoln and Breckinridge. Gertrude despised idleness, so she had spent the entire period of my sickness reading and working around the house. "My grandson is gone. I am sorry for us both," she said stiffly. "Are you well, then?" She was a hard woman, nothing but flint and cold metal. Clarence told me she had lost more than her share of children. He was the only child of the Armitage clan, but there had been 2 brothers and a sister before him, all lost to disease from the noxious summer air. Whatever conditioning turned her so cold had not yet happened to me, and her words made me break down into tears all over again. This was the only white woman I had known in the South, and she would be with me for the rest of her days. Gertrude set down her knitting and seemed to hesitate at my sudden outburst of grief. "Well, perhaps you had better go to the gravesite. The summer season is winding down, and we should be away from this place soon. There is talk of turning it into a fort, should Lincoln win, so it may be some time before you can return." Her lips wormed and twisted while she waited for some reaction from me, a horrible affectation that happened every time she talked about secession. The truth about my mother-in-law is that she could never trust a Yankee in those dark times, and now her son had married one. The fact that I had lost my first child was only proof of my lack of pedigree. Once I'd collected myself, Bila helped me, and we all 3 went out the front door, past the white fence surrounding the cleared property, and down the path through the cotton fields to a little patch of forest. The cemetery was broken down into 2 sections. The one first, with wooden crosses and simple stones, was dedicated to the slaves.
Byla looked at it wistfully as we walked by. When I asked her later, she said that generations of her ancestors were buried there, all the way to the people stolen across the sea to this land. All the stillborn children were buried there too, including a little one Byla had lost, because she had gotten pregnant just before the hardest work in the cotton fields. So now we both had a child in the soil. The white part of the cemetery had only a handful of tombstones. Most of them leaned at odd angles and were blackish green from sitting alone through the many years on the island. The newest one, bright white and almost glowing in the morning sun, was a simple square block with a name chiseled on it. The block read, Daniel Armitage. "Why Daniel?" I asked. No one had thought to consult me on what my boy was to be named. Gertrude sniffed. I had to put something on there. They could not just write baby. Clarence agreed with the decision and thought you would like it. Would it matter if I did not? I asked absently. She looked at me as if I'd asked an absurd question. Not unless you can change stone. Dear Camilla, let me speak as one with experience in these matters. It is best we are away and you are back in Charleston. The thing of mine needs is work. I can be a strict teacher, but soon you will be running my son's household as efficiently and courteously as any woman. The whole notion dazed me. Learn to run a slave household? Gertrude had already criticized everything I did here on Ryland, and that was only what I did with 2 slaves. Back in Arkham, I had barely been able to reprimand the servants when they were late. With slaves, there was a whole range of customs I was ignorant of. You had to be much harsher and more fearful in the Deep South, and yet, if you were seen as unkind, it was considered unwomanly. The charade was preposterous, and yet that was what was expected. I did not know if I had the strength for it. Gertrude, for her part, seemed to be carved from the same material as my son's grave. I said my prayers for my little baby. Then we all went back inside. Byla said I needed to rest while Gertrude had a broth prepared. The slave Gideon began to pack the boat. We would row out tomorrow to return to Charleston. That night my dreams were scattered and feverish. I confess that I thought I heard crying somewhere and I woke in a panic. Then I realized it was some remnant of my son's memory, and I cried even harder. As I review these lines, I realize I've made Clarence look like a brute. What sort of man leaves his wife stranded on some island under such horrible conditions? He did come to visit me during my illness, but was constantly being called away on political matters. The split with the Democrats was going to divide all the voters so thoroughly that the once vague possibility of Lincoln winning was now a reality. South Carolina's sons and daughters might have to actually decide what to do once Washington was no longer pro-slavery. Even talking about it was awkward because no one knew what slave might be listening. The Negroes wore blank, indifferent masks whenever such matters were raised around them. We had a light breakfast of biscuits and soup, then made our way to the boat. The oars knocked against the dock lightly as we all boarded and Gideon began to paddle. Across the inlet I could see the reeds and grass of Carcosa, and beyond that the towering oak tree that somehow survived in the shallow sea. I was staring at the tree when I saw a flicker, like a small outline of someone far in the distance, like that of a child. I gasped. "Oh, Gideon, we must turn into the reeds. Someone is trapped out on that oak tree," I said. Gertrude turned and stared hard, but Byla only got a fearful look on her face. She had often said that place was haunted after the slave massacre all those years ago. "I don't see a thing," said Gertrude. "It is not as if someone could just wander out there by accident. Some movement of the grass has deceived your eyes." "But I thought I saw a little boy," I murmured. I immediately wished I could take the words back, for each of them now stared at me. "Even now I can guess what you were thinking, that I was still overcome with grief from loss of my poor Daniel. I swear to you, sister, that I saw something. You shall see. I shall explain soon just how right I am." No one said any more, and we rode on. This was my first proper look at Charleston from the sea. Charleston sits between two rivers that feed into a channel. Shipping boats of every size and shape moved inside these passages, which go between Sullivan's Island and James Island. Fort Moultrie and the new Fort Sumter guard the ships with fierce cannon, all of which was then owned by the federal government. Gertrude liked to claim that the forts hung over Charleston like a sword of Damocles. As Gideon rode us closer, I could see the tall steeples of the many churches built by the wealthy planters, for that is how it came by the name Holy City. The edge of the peninsula is called the Battery, where one can see the rows of houses where the wealthiest planters live. They sit on their porches and wait for the ships to come and go, taking their cotton to England and returning with the profits. The Armitage home was located on the Cooper River side of the city, along this same battery with a porch allowing one to sit and look out upon the whole channel. The house was the most delightful shade of pink, which Gertrude despised but I always adored. It makes me sad to think you will never be able to see it from the harbor. Even the twin islands of Ryland and Carcosa were visible far out into the sea from our home. I hoped this might be small comfort, because I would always be able to see where my Daniel was laid to rest. And so a life of sorts began. I met all the prominent families, such as the Rutledges, Calhouns, Pettigrews, and so on. Each was a long-established family, and tightly allied with the others in bonds of marriage and property. Sometimes I have wondered what it would be like if we'd met in a different time and under better circumstances. All their parties and dinner conversation were consumed by talk of the election and the specter of Lincoln's tyranny. "It can't possibly happen," was repeated so often that it became sort of a joke at parties. I did not chime in for fear of offending anyone because of my northern origins. As the summer finally began to fade, my routine in the household became fairly rigid. I awoke after sunrise and followed Gertrude while we patrolled the home to make sure all the evening work had been done. If a window was not closed or a stray cup left out, the slaves had to be scolded lest they forget their duties. When it was time to oversee breakfast, where Gertrude would stand with a wooden spoon and watch the cook and her helpers work, no one could start cooking before Gertrude arrived because the key to the storehouse hung around her neck. She would measure each bit of food necessary to make sure the slaves did not steal any. Often, claimed Gertrude, the slaves would sneak food back to their families, despite the fact that they were given a monthly allowance of corn and bacon. I once dared to say I did not think there was much harm in letting them have an extra biscuit or two. Gertrude flew into such a frightful rage that I had to take a step back. "No harm! My dear, these are not your silly Irish servants back in Arkham. This is a slave, bonded to your will by discipline alone. If you bend those rules for one, all of them will expect it. If you let slide one infraction, then the rule might as well not exist. Then one day you will wake up and discover that it is not your will being done by the slave, but their own, and then there shall be anarchy." As the elections drew near, Gertrude seemed to become more and more agitated. If even a little flour spilled onto the floor, her wooden spoon would strike. Many of the slaves began to avoid kitchen work, opting instead for cleaning or running errands outside the house. Eventually, Gertrude got wise to this, and she began to keep an enormous hourglass in the kitchen. When a slave would go out to fetch food or some task, she would turn it and warn them how much time remained. She warned there would be dire punishments if they were ever late. Gertrude's constant disapproval and criticisms grated against me. Nothing was good enough for her. When Clarence would return from the capital where they were debating secession, I would put on a lavish meal for him. Clarence was always full of praise in those moments, but Gertrude would just snipe and simmer with commentary. She hated me. She hated that I was from the North, and she hated that I wasn't an ardent supporter of slavery. One day I sent Gideon out to fetch a bag of onions from the market. These were located a good distance uptown, where stalls filled with slaves and free women sold all the produce from the surrounding farms. Planters were often uncomfortable there because they would be shouted at as if they were common white trash. Gideon's mother worked a stall, and I knew he would enjoy an opportunity to speak with her. Gertrude must have been lurking about because she turned her hourglass unbeknownst to me. When Gideon returned after the curfew drum sounded, she was ready with her wooden spoon. "Insolent Negro! You have dawdled and wasted your master's time," she shouted, raising her spoon as if it were a cudgel. Gideon cowered, for he could not defend himself against a white woman without risking an even more severe punishment. I could not stand back and let it happen. I walked between Gertrude and Gideon and raised my arms. "Gertrude, stop this at once! He was out on my permission. There is no cause to harm him." "I should have known," said the old crone. "For your information, it is against the law for a slave to be out of the house after curfew. How will this look for Clarence? My son has ambitions of political office. What will they say in the Senate if Clarence's wife is known for having a loose hand with her Negroes?" I faltered, crestfallen with guilt. Clarence talked constantly about his political ambitions, but I knew so little of the machinations of Southern politics. I could only encourage him and pledge my support as a wife properly should. Now Gertrude was threatening to tell him of my ineptitude with running a slave household, and it made me fear losing the last thing I still loved in the South. "Since it is clear you do not have the stomach to properly punish Gideon yourself, you must take him to the slave blocks." Gideon let out a cry of fear, but Gertrude only sneered. "I'm not going to have you sold, you silly man. Take him to the punishing house and hire someone to make him walk the wheel for the night. That will teach him not to take advantage of his ignorant mistress." Gideon's fear only subsided a little at this news. The wheel was a large wooden platform with a pillar running in the center and spokes like a wagon wheel above it. Leather handcuffs were nailed to the top, so that a slave's hands could be bound and they could be forced to walk for however many hours the master decreed. It was part of a new program in humane punishment for wayward slaves, although its real purpose was to find torture that did not permanently damage valuable property. There was nothing I could do. Gertrude's decision was clear. As the mother of the household, it would have been improper for me to argue with her further. Yet I still simmered inside with anger. As I wrote out the order for the slave block and handed Gideon the pass, his sorrowful gaze almost broke my heart. But what really hurt was the way Bila looked at me after that. Gertrude had forced me to take a side and turned me into one of them. I felt lonelier than ever in that moment. Such was my life before the dreams returned.
Cthulhu in the Deep South. By Kirk Battle. Read by Toby Nelson. Chapter 3.
The day before the election was an endless parade of foods and decorations for the household. Clarence intended to have the whole battery at our house. I would be expected to dress well and act the part of a perfect lady while I played hostess. Not even Gertrude could deny I would have to be a centerpiece for the event. Now please try and keep any wayward comments about slavery to yourself. You still have a lot to learn about the peculiar institution, and it is better you simply demur to your betters. Once news of Breckenridge's victory is telegraphed tomorrow evening, the party will practically take care of itself," Gertrude said as we walked among the slaves busy decorating. I was finding it better to just nod and agree when Gertrude spoke like this, because otherwise she would complain to Clarence, and I would be asked to please try for his sake. The whole house was to be covered with beautiful wreaths and tied with red, white, and blue ribbon. Clarence had a specially made American flag hung from the ceiling. Barrels of whiskey and rum were brought to the house for punch, while imported ice was carefully stored in the cellar. Chickens, turkeys, pheasants, oysters, every type of food you could imagine was prepared. The cooking began that night and would continue throughout the following day. There was little for me to do except sit and watch, so I took up a chair and tried to be useful by watching the slaves as they worked. I was sitting in this repose when Bila walked past me and jerked suddenly, staring. It was after supper, and Clarence was in the smoking room, while Gertrude sewed in her own quarters. You would have thought I'd shouted something at Bila, but I was only thinking about what a strange life I was leading, with perhaps a few stray thoughts of my Daniel. If not for my loss, I would have had a baby boy to hold rather than me just sitting in this house with nothing to contribute. Bila asked me if everything was all right, and I told her I was perfectly content. Yet she still suggested I go get some rest before the big day tomorrow. I resented the way she spoke because it made me feel as if I could not even sit still without being questioned. It was especially improper for a servant to talk that way. Regardless, I was tired and dozing, so I relented to her suggestion. That evening I tossed and turned without rest, trying to not think about Daniel and focus my mind on the big election celebration tomorrow. Have you ever dreamed in such a way that you felt as if you were half awake? I remember once when I was a little girl having this feeling of something dark and scary sitting on my chest and not being able to move. Remember how I cried and Father had to come tell me it was just a bad dream? Oh, sister, I beg you not to think me mad, but that is a little similar to the dreams I speak of in this record. My mind was conscious, yet my body still slumbered. I could hear and see, taste and touch, yet my body was still breathing as peacefully as a newborn someplace else. How to describe the dream? There were white shores but no ocean. You could sense the sea by smell, by the sensation of a cold, howling wind. For a long time I just stared out at the inky blackness, but then a red sun began to rise. I saw the island Carcosa appear, and there, in the center, was the great oak. Only this was far more vivid, far more true, because this time I saw a boy standing under the tree. I walked slowly at first, out into the inky void. Then when the boy began to wave, I broke into a sprint. I charged away from the white sand and out into the billowing black nether. Until I laid eyes on that child, I had not realized how truly alone I felt, how much I needed to be with someone who wanted my presence. The reeds and grass of Carcosa seemed to part into a path for me until I was there. The boy's face was soft and milky white, with great blue eyes just like Father's and that pert nose of yours I so adore, sister. He was one of us. I cried out and we embraced. When we touched, I knew it for certain. This was my child. "Oh, Mother, I'm so glad you have come," said my precious boy. "I called and called, but you never heard. I have waited years for you." I had 100 questions, first and foremost being to ask if any of this was real. He said that we were in a dream. Like me, at first you may doubt this, but I can only repeat what he told me. There are worlds beyond this meat and bone we wither within. My Daniel was trapped in this dream world, passed over Violet Ryland and left to wander alone. Few can traverse this place, but my boy had the special gift, which he now used to summon me. For miles he walked, from great plains and forests to cities that towered so high one could see the place where gods resided. Time does not pass in the dream world as it does here, and so my son told me it had been many years before he found his way back to Carcosa. He began to tell me of his adventures, but the stories only made me weep. He endured so many terrible things, at the hands of the strangest, most terrible monsters. Beasts that demanded he do cruel and unbearable things to innocent creatures to prove he was not from the dream world. Countless nights of longing for his mother and calling out to her. Yet now we had found a way to be together again. I tried to smile and tell him his parents were well in Charleston, but he could see right through me. Mother, I have come to warn you. Things are not as they seem in the waking world. You are in great danger. Daniel, what do you mean? The Armitages are not what they seem. Your husband, my father, his ancestors were once servants to a great and powerful being called Cthulhu. They were members of his cults before they betrayed their promise and disaster struck. I have done my best to spell the word, for when Daniel spoke it, he almost made a coughing sound that seemed like a nail file rasping on wood. He had a terrible look of fear on his face when he mentioned this being. He told me that Cthulhu was dreaded across the dream world, and that he was powerful beyond any human comprehension. Time and space could be traversed at will by this creature. I almost believed it was all nonsense, laughing a little and marveling that such strange thoughts could haunt my dreams. When Daniel saw that I did not believe him, he pointed out across the black sea where the stars twinkled. Mother, I have come to warn you that it is not safe among these people. You must seek out the keystone if you are to avoid the mighty Cthulhu's wrath, he said. Out across the black sea I could detect an empty mass where there were no stars on the horizon. A loud pounding sound began to ring out, faint at first, but then throbbing so long in my ears that I wondered how I had ever missed it. Daniel, do not say such a thing. We are together, and your father would never let any harm come to me, I said anxiously. And what was a keystone? And what did that distant, lightless void have to do with me? No, Mother, you must listen. You must come to the great oak at Carcosa. Not in this world, but the waking one. There you will find something precious. Take it and put it in water. Do this, or I shall never be free, said Daniel. The pounding sound around us shook so hard that I fell against the tree while I covered my ears. Ice cold spread all over my body as I writhed against the jagged wood. When I looked up to see what caused this sensation, I began to scream because I could now perceive a monstrous face. It was like some octopi or squid washed ashore in Arkham, but its eyes were arranged in the most hideous pattern of nauseating disorder. They seemed to bore into me like nails on tattered canvas. I awoke as I almost fell out of my bed. Outside, the curfew drums were being beaten to warn all Negroes in Charleston that they were to be indoors unless they had a pass. I rose and looked out my window across the channel to where Carcosa and Ryland lay. Sister, please know that at first I was as suspicious and baffled as you must be now. The notion that my son was alive seemed a complete absurdity. Wilder still was the notion of ever going out to desolate Carcosa for any reason. But the images lingered, and I did not sleep for the rest of the evening. The day of the election is a whirl in my mind. I did not get much sleep, and the whole day was nothing but politics. To every person who asked, the Armitages would stand with slavery or they would be damned. Gertrude had little patience for me that day, always snapping when she caught me at the window looking out across the channel. Clarence asked me to be cheerful and bright as a good wife should, and I promised to do my best. The guests began to arrive in the blue twilight after the polls closed, and results were soon to be telegraphed. Finely dressed slaves in white coats drove gilded carriages down the sandy road of the Battery to our pink home. The planter elite of the Holy City wore the most beautiful dresses and suits which credit could buy, resplendent as they were with the wealth of cotton. The fashion that year was a deep blue from India, but only a handful of ladies had been able to get the fabric. I myself wore a yellow gown that Gertrude picked out, but which I found a bit juvenile. Clarence thought it made me look young, so I relented and wore it. We greeted the guests as they came in, every great family along with their sons, daughters, cousins, and close friends. The house was packed well before the gaslights were lit along the Battery. While Clarence was pulled away for cigars and politics, I made myself comfortable at the punch bowl with Gertrude and the other ladies. Gentlemen would bow and make our acquaintance as they fetched drinks. My mind wandered, while Gertrude seemed content with my silence. I still pondered what Daniel had said. How could anything be more silly than believing in some strange, dark monster? Or that the Armitage uncle who ran off all those years ago worshipped such a thing? I did what any sane person would do, and began to accept that it had all been a fanciful dream. My thoughts were interrupted when a tall, elderly man, with a jovial smile but grim lines under his eyes, approached me. "Mrs. Armitage, if I may?" "You may," I demurred, wanting to play my part as best I could. "My name is James Pettigrew," he explained. "I have heard of your Massachusetts origins. Arkham, is it not?" "Yes," I said carefully, hoping this would not lead to any unpleasantness. On the night of the election of all nights, I had no desire for my Yankee home to be brought up. Gertrude eyed us both, like an old owl who has seen a mouse scampering. "Splendid. I'm the president of the South Carolina Historical Society here in Charleston. We would be delighted to have you present for one of our talks and to give your opinion about some of the readings." An odious man, fat and humpbacked with a great pimple on his nose, overheard our talk and snorted. His punch sloshed in his cup as he dragged himself into our conversation. "What Mr. Pettigrew means is that he would like a more unionist opinion to support his silly readings." Pettigrew sniffed. "Mrs. Armitage, allow me to introduce Robert Barnwell Rhett." "Delighted," said the man, sweat glistening on his brow despite the November chill. "Chief editor of the Charleston Mercury, professional fire-eater." "Eater what?" I asked. "A colloquialism, my dear, meaning I support secession from the Union should the tyrant federal government seek to take away our freedom." "You mean you'd destroy all our forefathers' sacrifice to forge this nation over one silly presidential election," grumbled Pettigrew. "It is my forefathers that I'm honoring by rebelling against a tyrannical government," shouted Rhett. Seeing that I was a loss to halt the growing unpleasantness, Gertrude stepped forward. "Gentlemen, if you would be so kind as to take this talk into the smoking room, where all the other miscreants have gathered. Of course, should you prefer to dance with a lady instead?" Both Pettigrew and Rhett demurred, bowed very slightly, and moved away from the punch bowl. Gertrude gave me a stern look as if I was somehow responsible for the entire argument, before turning back to the other guests. The other crises of the evening were far easier to resolve. A girl's brother got into a fight with the man who tried to take her for a walk along the Battery. Another gentleman had to excuse himself after clearly having had a little too much punch. Once the band began playing, a space was made in the crowd and people danced up and down in a line. There was a contest among the ladies to get their fans signed by each boy who danced with them, so that they might show off who had the most dance partners. Married ladies were not allowed such games, yet I enjoyed watching them gossip and bat their eyes at red-cheeked boys. I was not familiar with many of the dances, but I did know the Virginia Reel. When the band called out the song, I ran to find Clarence, who was deep in conversation with a circle of politicians. I grabbed him by the arm and dragged him away, despite his protests, while the other men laughed. Clarence finally relented, kissed me tenderly, and put his arm around my waist. We led the group, and for a brief time I was able to forget everything and just be happy. My strange dreams, all of Gertrude's bothering, it all seemed to fade away. As the dance came to a close, I was out of breath, but I still pleaded with Clarence to stay for another. He was too busy looking around the party to pay me any mind. His eyes fell on a slave who had just come in carrying an envelope, and Clarence waved him over. He took up the envelope and jumped onto stage before the band could fire up another song. He called for everyone's attention, and then, glancing up to see the huge American flag hanging over everyone, he tore open the message. "I have in my hands the results of the election. Friends, countrymen, South Carolinians," said Clarence as he unfolded the letter. Then his eyes went down and his expression fell. He looked as if he were frozen without purpose. "What is it? What does it say?" called Pettigrew. Clarence looked out over the audience, and the answer was so obvious, the shock so palpable that a woman screamed. Men began to shout, calling out against tyranny and the threat against their rights. I quickly looked to the slaves themselves, but their eyes were all downcast. They rightly guessed their masters would be more prone to punishment in this state of agitation. Bila began cleaning up empty punch glasses, while Gideon headed for the door to help anyone who would be going home. "You have already guessed the terrible news in my hands," called Clarence over the chaos. "I ask that you all go home and be with your loved ones. Thank God that we are together and united in our cause. We are first and foremost South Carolinians, and we will never let some Kentucky drunkard boss us about." The wives and daughters looked dubious, but the men all began shouting and cheering. I heard talk of fighting and rebellion, each one declaring they could squarely beat any Yankee every day of the week. Robert Barnwell Rhett looked every bit the fire-eater he claimed to be, eyes blazing as he called for the men to pick up a copy of tomorrow's newspaper. He kept shouting, "War!" over and over as the young boys charged out onto the battery. It was the grim look on Pettigrew's face that sent a shiver down my spine. Only he seemed to have an inkling of what was coming. I joined Bila in picking up the scattered cups and dropped fans as the party ended and everyone left. I knew that it was not proper for a Southern lady to participate in such servant work, but I was restless. When I looked to see if Gertrude had noticed, she was deep in conversation with Robert Rhett and my husband. They were whispering furiously about something, and I even caught Gertrude looking at me a few times as they spoke. The memory of the dream suddenly filled me in that moment. It seemed more vivid and real than the past few minutes as the waking world turned upside down. Why should my dreams seem any more farcical than the goings-on around me? I still had sense enough to wonder at my own sanity and how it could be slipping. I told everyone that I was exhausted and wished to retire to bed. They heartily agreed, and Clarence even looked a little relieved that they could speak without my presence. What they wished to discuss I do not know. When I came up to my bedroom, I felt the cold air and realized the window was open. Far out across the channel I could again see Carcosa and Ryland, looming like twin fists punching through the water's membrane. What was out there? Why did my son want me to go fetch something for him in that desolate place? "Oh, Daniel," I whispered. "What is happening?"
Cthulhu in the Deep South by Kirk Battle. Read by Toby Nelson. Chapter 4.
In my sleep that evening, Daniel returned, and with him all my hopes resumed that this might be more than a dream. He walked and talked with me as if we had never parted. He again pleaded for me to go to Carcosa where the great oak stood and fetch something.
He told me not to be afraid, and that sometimes he could hear me when I was looking out toward the islands. He asked me how long it would be until I journeyed to Carcosa in the waking world. I said I did not know. That hurt Daniel, and he went away, leaving me along the white shores until even the sand faded with the light of a red dawn. I awoke and sat myself down in the chair by the window, looking out toward the islands where I knew my son was buried. Were my dreams to be forever haunted by this ghost? Was I going mad, or was it all real? I tried to imagine rowing out there on my own, but I had no inkling of how hard the journey might be. Gertrude would certainly forbid it, and I doubted Clarence would think me going to Ryland was very healthy, much less over to Carcosa with its seagrass fields. Daniel, I'm so sorry, but it is just so odd, I said aloud to the window, hoping my boy might hear. Clarence is good and kind to me, even if this dreadful slavery business is proving to be beyond my abilities. You don't know how much I loathe the duties of running this household. I would give anything to just be with you. Please come back to your mother, Daniel, so that I might care for you. The door creaked behind me, and I turned, alarmed that someone might have been listening. Clarence stood in the doorway looking thoughtful, holding a tray with coffee, biscuits, and jam. I was not sure if he heard me or not, but I pretended embarrassment because I was still in my bedclothes. "It's all right, my love. Back under the covers with you," said Clarence carefully. I slipped between the sheets and tried to not betray any anxiousness. Surely he would think me mad if he heard me conversing with Daniel. What was I to tell him? That our son lived in some other realm where time followed its own peculiar rules? I buttered my biscuit and smiled appreciatively. "I've not been a good husband to you," murmured Clarence, taking my former seat by the window. He pulled it close to the bed, but not before he glanced out at Ryland across the windy channel. "I have not been a good father either. Just the other day Mother was reminding me that I have never been to our son's grave." "Oh, but your work is so important," I said, trying to keep my eyes from straying to the window. "My love, I do not neglect you because I care for you any less. What I do is for us. With Lincoln's election, great changes are afoot, changes that the Armitage family shall be a part of, like the important and powerful family we once were before my uncle's fall from grace. There is open talk of secession now." Clarence took my hand and kissed it. He rubbed it tenderly and looked at me with deep concern. "I would never do anything to hurt you, but will you be all right if I am away for a little longer? They are calling a Congress in Columbia to discuss South Carolina's future. If I go, they may make me a representative, perhaps even more." I squeezed his hand and tried to smile reassuringly. "Of course, Clarence, I will be fine here. Truly, I will. You have no need to worry about me." He looked at me carefully, and again I cringed inwardly at the thought that he had heard me speaking to the window. These were the moments where I most adored my husband, when it was just the two of us, together sharing our affections with no worry for the outside world or my mother-in-law pawing away at our happiness. I gazed at him and felt my love flow uninhibited for the first time in ages. Clarence beamed and leaned in for a kiss. Then he seemed about to stand before something crossed his mind. "There is one other thing. Mother said you met Robert Barnwell Rhett last night. She and he are part of a group. It is an organization that has been secret, but which may begin meeting here more often." My heart quickened, and I pulled my hand away, fearing I would squeeze Clarence's too hard. Was this connected to that horrible dark being Daniel kept mentioning? I knew the uncle was involved, but surely not them as well. "What kind of meeting?" I asked as innocently as I could manage. "Oh, I've frightened you. I'm so sorry. It is just a committee, a group of vigilant South Carolinians who will watch and judge which citizens are loyal to our cause and which ones might be Union sympathizers. That James Pettigrew, for example, he is known to espouse settling with Lincoln and his black Republicans.
Do you understand what I'm saying? You must be very careful about what you say and do, my love. I know you care for this family and that you are an Armitage now, but there will be many people who question your Yankee origins. I tried to understand what he meant, but my mind was too wrapped up around the notion of some sort of cult in my home. Daniel had said the being they worshipped was named Cthulhu, but the uncle betrayed him long ago. None of it seemed real. I longed to ask more questions of my baby, to nurture him and make him feel comfortable, but I could not do that around Clarence. He would never understand that our son was growing up without us in some faraway place. I understand, husband. Clarence smiled and looked relieved. Do as mother says. Be courteous and follow all rules regarding the slaves, and you shall be fine. If there is any trouble, then send word to Columbia at once. Farewell. Farewell. I struggled to resist repeating all of this to the window. Of course, there was little chance of Daniel ever returning to this world. How could he come back when his infant corpse lay in the ground? Yet he was near, trying to warn me of something terrible approaching. Now Clarence spoke of secret meetings and great changes coming. I longed for someone to talk to and thought again of Daniel's request. I knew that with Clarence leaving, the household would be distracted, so it was now or never. I dressed and went downstairs to find a slave. There was no cooking to be done, thanks to all the uneaten food from the party. Much would have to be given away, since it would rot otherwise. Bila had a great stew pot over a few embers that she stirred absently. I sat next to her and looked carefully to make sure Gertrude was not nearby. Bila seemed lost in her own thoughts as she worked, only glancing at me to nod hello. Did she understand what Lincoln's election might portend? There was no simple way to request going to Carcosa. Every time I asked about the watery island, Bila only said it was haunted by her ancestors, who had been hung on the limbs of the great oak tree. Now I needed her or some other slave to take me there. Clarence would not be here to contradict the request, yet Gertrude could say something. They all thought I was struggling with the loss of the baby and life here in Charleston, but nothing could be further from the truth. I felt perfectly fine because I was animated with purpose now. I did not even want to go to the graveside. I wanted to go to the great oak, to discover what my dreams promised. I could perhaps claim a trip to visit Ryland and my son's grave, but Carcosa was nothing but grass and mud. Maybe a slave could have a reason to go out there, and I could merely request to accompany them. Her eyes bulged. I realized immediately I had done something wrong. Perhaps such questions usually led to an interrogation. The master's fear that a slave might run away could produce terrible punishments. The election would have everyone on edge with paranoia that their slaves might discover their condition was not absolute. Fear in white people led to violence for slaves. I'd almost forgotten about the grim lynchings that came after the slave riot of 1837 over on Ryland. I apologize. I did not mean to imply anything. I'm still learning the ways of slavery. With the news of the election, it made me curious why everyone is so... I trailed off, not sure what I could say or not say. What I meant to ask was why everyone was so terribly frightened all the time to discuss slavery when it surrounded us. Everything in Charleston was supported and supplanted by slave labor, yet we all tiptoed around the conversation. Here I had stepped in it when all I really wanted was to be rowed out across the channel. "Mrs., you have a good heart," began Bila. Then she bit her lip before looking around. "Where you come from, servants just work for pay. That's all there is between you. With us down here, I got brothers and sisters that are spread out around the Armitage plantations. My mama was set free 4 years ago because she was too old to work and she doesn't have anywhere to go. So now she works in the markets selling crackers and spices. I bring her what food I can, and if it weren't for me, she'd starve." Bila took a deep breath and turned back to the stew pot, for it was easier to talk to me without seeing my face. "I don't know how to do anything but this life here, so don't ask me about leaving. Miss Gertrude would have me whipped just for having this talk. She would say I'm not supposed to abuse you, not knowing how slavery works." There was no appropriate reaction. What could I say? This was an institution that had existed before either of us was born, and now my own husband was leaving for Columbia to defend it. I took a deep breath and focused on myself, for there was nothing I could do for Byla's plight. I needed to get out to Carcosa and see that tree. I needed to know if there was anything there or if I was truly going mad. Byla, I want you to fetch Gideon. Tell him to get a boat ready to take me out to Carcosa. Miss? My patience was wearing thin. Do not question me, Byla, and do not tell Gertrude what we are doing, I said sharply. Byla bowed and went out the door, calling for Gideon. He came out from the carriage house where he had been tending to the horses, and she repeated my commands. They both stared at the kitchen where I could see them, and I guess some whispered conversation was taking place. Then Gideon was off to fetch a boat. I packed a light lunch of bread and a wax-sealed jar with salted pork. After a moment I remembered Daniel's warning and brought a jar of fresh water as well. Whatever was in that tree had to be stored in water. He had called it a keystone, but then why would that require water for storage? There was no sense in asking questions, so I simply acted. All the slaves in the house seemed to be tiptoeing around me now, but I did not care what they thought. My heart was set. The only way to be certain of anything was to go out to Carcosa and see that tree for myself. As Clarence headed off to clamor for secession and Gertrude was caught up in secret committees, my actions did not seem any more senseless. Everyone else had gone mad since Lincoln's election. What was one wayward northerner acting strange now? Our house on the Battery was just a short walk from the brick and stone facade that lined the edge of the city. Little staircases were carved intermittently into the stonework where someone could pull up a boat for quick travel to the surrounding islands. I put on my sunbonnet and a good heavy jacket before going out to wait. It was a sunny day, and despite the long cold teeth of winter, the air was pleasant. Gideon arrived and said little, only asking once where I wanted to go, as if he did not already know. Huge lumbering ships creaked and dragged on their anchors all around us as we rowed across the channel to our destination. The farther we got out to sea, the more the wind blew, as if it sought to buffet us back to the Battery. The sun still pulsed above, but I could not feel it any more because of the wind. I began to doubt this trip and almost said something, but the church steeples of the holy city were already far away, and it was too late to turn back. Finally, we drew near to Carcosa. I almost expected the grass to part as it did in my dream, but of course it did not. Gideon rowed around the island until he found a suitable spot to paddle the boat deeper into the eddies and currents of the grassy interior. Once we reached a certain depth, he stood in the boat and began to dip the oar into the ground, pushing us against the current and the winter winds. The blistering gusts seemed to rattle the half-frozen grass around us so that the reeds rubbed together like old bones. "How far are we going, missus?" "To the tree." Gideon pushed us deep into Carcosa, his back muscles working hard against the current, and then the watery course diverged into 3 directions. He stopped and stared, unsure of which way to take. Now that we were in the grass itself, the course to the great oak did not seem clear at all. I could still see the branches of the tree reaching out to the sun in their strange eldritch worship, but now I feared we would get lost and never make it. Sister, if you have not believed a word I have written yet, then I ask you now to believe this. In that moment, I thought of Daniel, closing my eyes and clasping my hands as if in prayer. In no time at all, I felt such fierce certainty about where to go that it was as if he had spoken. "To the left," I said, pointing in case Gideon did not know what I meant. He looked at me dubiously, but as we went farther up the watery trail, it was obvious this was the way. Gideon's eyes narrowed, and he began to murmur little prayers while he pushed. I felt anxious too, because I did not know what waited for me at the tree. Twice more we came to forks in the grass streams, and twice more I closed my eyes until the direction felt certain. When we finally approached the great oak, there was far more land around the tree than I had expected.
It was an almost oblong circle of blackened earth and stone. Gideon angled the boat so that the side was up against the land before he hunkered down with his oar, ready to flee as soon as he could. Gideon was convinced creatures were going to attack us at any moment, but I knew Daniel would not have sent me here if it were not safe. The wind had stopped now. The sun was still shining bright, and I stepped onto land that had not been walked upon in decades. I circled the lonely tree and detected nothing but empty desolation. There were relics buried in the ground that were old farm tools, bowls, and other slave implements. Other stones seemed more ornamental, depicting horrid faces that were almost humanoid except where the mouth should be, instead was a mass of writhing tentacles. It reminded me of the face I had seen in my dream, but this was a worn and weak imitation of that graven image. Perhaps the slaves all those years ago had brought some of their gods with them. Or maybe they found a new one here. I was on the far end of the little island and beginning to feel foolish when something caught my eye. Nestled into the gnarled roots of the great oak was something that shimmered and shifted in the winter sun. I tried to reach my hand out and take it, but the item seemed to move away like how one's reflection might shift in a rippling pool of water. It was there, and not there. I knew I had to take it somehow, and so again I closed my eyes. I reached my hand down into the tree and felt certain that someone was guiding me. I finally grasped an unknown thing which was cold and firm. A great deal of time must have gone by, because my next memory was Gideon calling out for me to hurry. He would not be out on Carcosa during the night, and he did not care what it cost him to leave now. There was something distinctly in my hand, but it seemed to squirm like a fresh-caught worm. Hurrying to my lunch basket, I stuck it in the glass jar full of fresh drinking water. To my shock, within moments the water froze. It was just as Daniel had said.
Cthulhu in the Deep South. By Kirk Battle. Read by Toby Nelson. Chapter 5.
We rowed back across the channel while the sun sank behind us. The darkening water gave us no trouble because torches and bonfires lit up the holy city. News of the election had now reached Charleston, and there were people parading in the streets and screaming for war. A carriage house accidentally caught fire, but was snuffed out in time, and the sheriff had to be called to warn people of the dangers of uncontrolled flame. Everyone in the city was mad for secession, revenge, and whatever else would satiate their fear. Our boat docked as two white men marched up to ask Gideon what he was doing before they saw me and quickly scurried off. I tucked away the jar with its frozen contents in my picnic basket where the food remained untouched. I hurried upstairs before Byla or Gertrude saw me and set the jar on my bed. After lighting a candle, I examined the jar more closely and saw that it truly did seem to just be a jar of frozen water. Yet there was no condensation, no indication of melting or any other natural property. The light from the candle did seem to move strangely when I tried to perceive it through the ice. It seemed to rotate and dilate of its own mind rather than the position to which I held it. After all of Daniel's insistence that I go out to Carcosa and retrieve something, I realized now I had no clue what should happen next. That night in my dreams, I stood on a white shore and heard the same resolute pounding in the bleak void. Off in the distance, I could still dimly see Carcosa and the sprawl of the oak. I called and shouted for Daniel to appear, to explain what was required next, but nothing happened. I even shouted once at the void, but no reply came. I awoke and immediately went to the window and implored him to return, but still nothing came the following night.
and so I was left alone again. Outside there were mobs marching in the streets, rifles blasting, and men wearing uniforms they had cobbled together should any armed Yankees cross their path. One crowd even had a man made of straw that they lit on fire before the sheriff again came out and warned them of having fires in the city. I heard it all as I sat in my bedroom, whispering to Daniel and trying to discern some purpose to this frozen jar and whatever strange object it contained. Eventually the crowds grew bored and their eyes turned toward Fort Moultrie and the not yet finished Fort Sumter. In one fort an entire garrison of troops remained silent as the fervor raged around them. If secession did come for South Carolina, these two forts would be an even more intolerable threat than whatever haunted them now. Things in the house grew equally tense with Clarence gone. Gertrude and I would try to talk occasionally, but it became so hard to listen to her constant prattling of Lincoln. Bila was little comfort, because despite my attempts at being kind, something was different after my return from Carcosa. The slaves began to complain of sleeping problems and bad dreams. More than a few times I would hear them whispering about my room. I practically had to drag Bila in there when it was time to clean. He would have thought I was as bad as Gertrude from the way they started behaving. And so I began to keep to my room more, where I could gaze out the window and look upon the islands. That reminds me, sister, you have no doubt been poring over my old letters from this period. Before I was simply confused about what was happening, but at this time I had to carefully watch what I was saying because the letters leaving the city were all being read. They claimed it was concern for spies, but I think Gertrude and the rest of the Vigilance Committee were a little thrilled to suddenly have such authority. I could not risk anyone discovering the frozen object tucked carefully away in my dresser, so I wrote of nothing but pleasant things to you. Allow me to illustrate my condition. In early December, while I was sitting in my room knitting and talking to Daniel through the window, there was a knock and Gertrude was at the door. Clarence had been gone some days now because the debate for secession was going on furiously in the capital of Columbia. Gertrude gave me that tiring look of hers where she acts as if I am some intolerable burden before pulling up a chair. "You missed a stitch," she said, eyeing my needlework. It was a pair of tiny blue socks that I thought I might give away to one of the slaves or someone else in need. Certainly my Daniel wouldn't need them. His body in this world was surely rotten and gone by now. "Thank you," I replied stiffly. For a moment I was briefly scared that she had discovered the frozen jar, but I was confident that it was well hidden. Besides, I so rarely left the room that I did not think she would have even had a chance to look. "I could use an extra pair of eyes downstairs, should you feel well enough to return to your duties," said Gertrude. It was just like her to feign that I had some kind of sickness when nothing could be further from the truth. The slaves did not listen to me, and every order I gave had to be repeated to her anyways. What did it matter if I wanted to spend my time in the room waiting for Daniel to contact me? "The servants have been an absolute chore to manage lately. At first I let them have a little cup of rum just to get some quiet, but now that's not enough. You know, Gideon is claiming he saw a cat walking backward the other day. Such nonsense they will tell you to get out of working. They're all begging to be sent back to Ryland or one of the outlying plantations. In all my years I've never heard of a slave asking to be sent away from the house where his master resides." For a moment I could see the genuine worry and exhaustion on Gertrude's face. There was so much going on in Charleston now. She was watching her whole world turn upside down. I shared in her worries, for if the South truly did secede, what would happen to us? What would the slaves do? "It's only the crowds and shouting in the street that has them frightened," I said, trying to ease her worry. "Once things are quiet, they will no longer be different." Gertrude said nothing for a time, looking out my window across the channel. Finally she mused. "I wonder how much they really understand about what's going on. I do what I was taught. I keep them from reading and writing. I feed and clothe. I provide shelter. Yet when I look at them now, I find I barely know them at all.
I put my hand on hers reassuringly, setting aside the little blue socks. Gertrude looked at my hand before her gaze went back out to Ryland and Carcosa, back where the empty house and little grave of my baby waited in the cold winds. Camilla, do you think you would be up for doing something that would support our family? Yes, of course, I said, a little surprised at her sudden frank tone. Gertrude had never asked me to do anything. Clarence has told you of the Vigilance Committee, has he not? Yes. I trailed off, not sure what services I could offer such a group. Do you recall James Pettigrew, the way he spoke of treasonous sympathies at the election party some days back? My brow creased, and I tried to remember what Gertrude described. I could recall William Butler Rhett and his talk of newspapers and secession. I knew Pettigrew had invited me to his historical society. But treason? I shook my head and tried to smile supportively. Never mind, said Gertrude. I was there for the whole thing. What we require is for you to invite Mr. Pettigrew to our home this evening. Tell him you wish to discuss history or something. He will not turn down a lady, and when he arrives, the committee will be here to ask him a few questions. Is that not dishonest? What will happen to him? They are only questions. Wouldn't you like to help your husband? He will be coming home soon, you know. Really? Oh, that's wonderful news. What did they decide about secession? They have not yet voted. Smallpox has broken out in Columbia. Tomorrow they will arrive for the final vote. It has been requested that we resolve any loose ends before such a thing happens, said Gertrude. When you are ready, I've already drafted the invitation for you. I only need your signature. She removed an envelope from her winter shawl and withdrew the card. It was stationery meant for Clarence and me. At the top was written Camilla Armitage in flowing print, and a request for Mr. James Pettigrew's company at the Armitage home on the Battery. Refreshments and company would be present. It was so deceptive that I could not help but wonder what else Gertrude and this secret group of hers might be capable of. But why do you not simply ask him to come and profess his loyalty? I asked. If he is a spy, then he is not very likely to be forthright about it, is he? At the very least, he may decide to take a ship or train out of town before word can get out about his character, said Gertrude, pressing the invitation into my hand. I had no other reason to not acquiesce. This was my family now, and I knew Clarence had asked for me to listen to his mother. I took a pencil from my writing desk, the same one I write at now, and added my signature. The envelope vanished back into Gertrude's shawl as she rose. You do not have to attend. It may be distressing for you, as you are not a Southerner. She left, and I returned to my knitting, more disturbed than ever. I told Daniel I didn't like the sound of this one bit. What kind of people take to interrogating their own neighbors while they clamor for revolution? If their secession was so perfect and wonderful, why did they have to get rid of people who disagreed with it? Daniel said nothing, naturally. I was just talking toward Carcosa. But he had said in my dream that he could hear me, and so I kept at it for comfort. My gaze shifted to the dresser where the frozen object was tucked into a drawer. I asked Daniel again what I was supposed to do with it. If I showed it to anyone, there would be questions, and I did not want to risk anyone thinking me insane. When I closed my eyes, sometimes I did think I could feel something inside the jar, a comforting certainty that I had made my son very happy. I liked to believe Daniel was out adventuring across the dream world. Perhaps he no longer had need of his dear mother to comfort him and listen to his troubles. In those moments I wished that Clarence would return and we could try to have another child. But then I would fill with such passion for Daniel and I would forget about anything except staying by the window. The invitation had said 6 o'clock, and the setting sun meant it would soon be time. I wondered about this vigilance committee and what their interests truly were. Was it just the war, or was Daniel right that the Armitages were involved with something far more insidious? If it were not for the ever-frozen object in my dresser, perhaps I would have kept my doubts pushed down, but now they were ravaging my heart with anxious worry. The drums beat for the slaves to return to their masters. I dressed in a simple evening gown and headed downstairs. There were only a few candles and lamps lit in the hall, but I could hear voices in the library. The drums meant it was well past 9 in the evening, so I moved on tiptoe. I could hear William Barnwell Rhett speaking in that bleating tone of his. "Do you deny, Mr. Pettigrew, that you are a regular recipient of the New York Times?" "Good Lord, have you been going through my mail?" "Do not change the subject." "Yes, along with Harper's Weekly, the Philadelphia Inquirer, and even your little rag, the Charleston Mercury, although lately you have only printed your mad ravings for secession," said Pettigrew. "Mad ravings? Is that what you call patriotism and love for South Carolina?" There was some kind of knock and a loud crash. I heard a few calls before Pettigrew began shouting. "Sir, I demand you take that back, or we shall duel on this matter. I'm not a criminal just for believing that her best future is with the Union. If she secedes lawfully and by the will of her people, then I will follow them." I knew it would be a terrible thing for me to interrupt now, so I did not open the door. I opted to kneel and peer through the keyhole instead. Arranged in a table over dim candles was the Vigilance Committee. Gertrude and a few others sat in stony silence, while Pettigrew and Rhett fumed at each other in the center of the room. A chair was knocked over, no doubt the source of the loud crash. "Do you swear loyalty to the South above the Union?" demanded Rhett. Pettigrew looked around at the faces. These were his neighbors, people he had attended school with and grown up alongside. He looked sad for a moment before nodding. "I swear I will support secession, if that is what they decide tomorrow." The people around the table spoke in whispers for a time before Gertrude chimed a glass with a little fork. "I dare say many people will declare such things until secession is finalized. What matters, Mr. Pettigrew, is whether or not you will interfere with the official delegates when they arrive. How will you act?" "I put my faith in God and our elected officials. I shall stay home." There was a cheer, and the committee members seemed quite pleased at these words. Pettigrew looked ashen, though. I pulled away from the keyhole and hastened back up the stairs before any of them detected me. The entire exchange made me petrified with fear. What would happen if someone found out about the frozen jar? Would Gertrude and her friends become suspicious enough to question me? I needed to find Daniel before time ran out.
Cthulhu in the Deep South. By Kirk Battle. Read by Toby Nelson. Chapter 6.
The group downstairs soon dispersed after their little hearing. I knew then that I could no longer just whisper things out the window while keeping the keystone in my room. I wished fervently that Clarence was home tonight instead of on the road. Comfort, human contact, and genuine good cheer was all that I craved. I had not experienced these emotions except in fleeting gasps since I arrived in the Deep South. Clarence was constantly off chasing his political career, while Gertrude served as some gnarled totem to my complete incompatibility with the South. I longed for you, dear sister, and father and mother back when she was alive. But most of all, I longed for Daniel to guide me out of this accursed situation. I opened my dresser drawer and reached round till my hands felt a chill. There was nothing but a pregnant silence throughout the house, like the place might burst with noise at any moment. I still had no idea what it was as I unscrewed the lid of the jar and touched the ice experimentally. Perhaps I could turn it on and summon my child? Solid as rock, and yet, if I pressed on it, something seemed to reverberate in my very soul. My mind ached, but I kept pressing. I wanted to see Daniel. I wanted to comfort him with news of my trip to Carcosa and how I needed guidance. The texture of the ice seemed to change, becoming like sand yet still frozen. The harder I pressed, the more progress I seemed to make. Then there was a flash, and I felt as if I was turned upside down. My head was on the floor, and in the dim moonlight, the lines of the wooden boards seemed to grow and elongate, like I was shrinking while everything else grew larger. I cried out, but no sound came from my throat, so I lay silent while the room grew infinitely larger. "Mother?" whispered a familiar voice. It came from the window looking out across the channel. I could not utter a reply, but I recognized the voice as Daniel's. I writhed as I implored his aid. "Be still, Mother. You did very well by bringing the keystone to your home. I'm sorry I have not come to visit as I once did. I have been dream-walking." White shores formed around me with the familiar expanse of stars above. When the first great boom from the void rang out, my body shot upright and I turned, finally seeing my baby. He looked different now, older, with handsome features. I scarcely recognized him but for the voice that I had heard and been comforted by so many times. "I missed you," I said, feeling control over my body slowly return. "I know in your heart you have been puzzled by the keystone, but it is dangerous for you to dream walk alone. If I reveal its purpose to you, will you then be content in the waking world for just a little longer?" asked Daniel. I nodded, relieved to see him again, but eager to have some grasp of what was going on. He beckoned me to follow, and we walked down the white beach. As we moved, the area around us began to change. Trees and mountains growing and fading as if they were seasons passing in seconds. This wasn't like the times I had visited him at Carcosa because I could sense him moving things, changing the world under his very feet, and I thought I could hear the music of it. The difference was my close contact with the keystone. I do not know how to elaborate on this further. There are no words to explain how one may walk in dreams. For someone in the waking world, it is like trying to talk to a fish about water. Suffice to say, I studied my son closely, and I began to perceive how I might move independently in a similar manner so long as I held the keystone close. We crossed into a desert of black rocks, with mountains so high they reached farther than I could see. All the while I could still hear the pounding of the black void like some crow gawking from a distant spire. We stopped at the top of a rocky ledge, and Daniel beckoned for me to crouch before approaching the cusp. Down below, on a winding path with jagged rocks on either side, was a procession of men, women, beasts, children, and then creatures that I cannot possibly describe. Some writhed and lurched like fish thrown onto land, while others resembled insects. All had a golden chain around their necks, and they followed their leader, a tall man with arched brows and wild hair. "That is the thief which is my prey, Mother." "Prey? Are you a hunter, then?" "I am a dream walker. I walk the dream world and seek." I marveled at this change in Daniel and the strange way he now spoke. My baby was older now, grown and fit, unlike the boy I had spent time with before. Had he aged in this strange land? Or was this all madness, and I had finally taken to having my dead child act as a man now? As I marveled that I may never see my child again, I began to weep. "Do not cry, Mother, for good things shall come yet. The thief seeks the keystone, and he has taken its scent. Even now he is coming to Charleston. All you must do is make sure he is kept there once he arrives. Can you do that for me?" "But, my son, my baby, what is happening to you? All this time you wanted me to fetch the keystone. Now you tell me it was to lure in that man? What about us? Soon you will have everything you desire. Once the thief has been caught, I will be free of this task, and then we can be together. The world shifted, and floorboards as big as city streets seemed to grow out of the ground. I perceived the action, but he moved too fast, and I did not yet know how to work the dream to my will. The dim moonlight filled the sky, and I felt the pulse of the keystone again. I was back in my room. My sorrow slowly began to ebb as I focused on the promise that we would be together again. I did not care what happened to me or this world any more. The South was wild for secession and war, and they could have it in buckets if that would make them happy. All I wanted was my baby, and if that meant being with him in another reality, then so be it. I climbed off the floor and got into bed, whispering good night to Daniel before I closed my eyes and entered a dreamless slumber. Clarence came in while breakfast was being served. I had surprised Gertrude that morning by appearing dressed and full of aplomb. Bila poured me coffee, and I ate as if the past few weeks of seclusion were perfectly normal. Clarence just burst in straight from the road with a joyful laugh and sat down to breakfast before anyone could get in a word. He was oblivious to the strange looks his mother was shooting me while he talked of the secession Congress. "If it weren't for those clay eaters up in Greenville, we would already have the thing done," said Clarence proudly. "Oh, you should have seen me. I was pounding on the lectern, preaching of the unity and support we clearly will get if the war comes. It was amazing. Everyone was cheering and clapping." "Why? What possible grounds could anyone have for not wanting to be independent?" asked Gertrude. "Oh, the usual rambling. Many of them are not slave owners, and they refuse to see secession as anything but a scam by the planters. They don't believe that the federal government will let us go in peace. Why, what are those Yankees going to do? March down here and occupy the entire South?" "Wouldn't they sail?" I asked, doing my best to be part of the conversation. Both Clarence and Gertrude looked at me before my husband smiled as one might to a wayward child. "Yes, my lovely, it will certainly be important for Charleston to invest in proper harbor defenses. Fort Moultrie and Fort Sumter will be essential in keeping our home safe. Perhaps they will even need to build something out on Ryland." The subject changed to politics as Gertrude gossiped about the latest tidbits overheard from Robert Bunch's table over at the British consulate's office. The British ambassador was doing his best to remain neutral, but the planters were all pressing him for any word on if the English would join the fray. Talk of cotton and markets droned on until my attention began to wander. After a time, I remembered Daniel's warning about a thief and wondered if there might be some news. "Clarence, did you see anyone strange on your way into Charleston?" Clarence set down his fork and studied me more intently now. That smile of condescension seemed to be bolted to his face. "Nothing specific sticks out, my sweet. Were you expecting someone?" "Well, it's just—" I trailed off, knowing better than to try and explain what our child had said about a thief coming for the frozen jar in my room. Gertrude was so wonderful about warning me of spies and that I must keep a constant vigil. I wanted you to know I was working for the cause. My husband seemed to relax at this, but Gertrude was still watching me. She changed the subject. "What time does the convention vote on the ordinance of secession?" "I hardly have a moment before I must be over to Broad Street. They are having it at St. Andrew's Hall." After a few more bites of some eggs, he was up and heading out the door, not even remembering to leave me with a kiss. Gertrude and I resumed eating in silence. Did she know that I had witnessed it? She had not mentioned the berating poor James Pettigrew received while Clarence was here. I still feared her discovering that not everything was as it seemed. Yet the threat of some thief coming for the keystone still alarmed me. If he was caught in my room and the jar was discovered, what would I say? After the meal, I began to look around the house for one of the slaves. I found Gideon out in the stable yard, taking the shoes off Clarence's horse and getting ready to file down the hooves. His head did not go up when I called his name, no doubt afraid I might try to drag him back to Carcosa.
None of the slaves seemed keen to make eye contact with me anymore. I called his name a second time, and he finally slowed in his work. Gideon, I want you to be extra careful about locking up the house at night. I have reason to believe a man is coming who means to steal something. Pardon, missus, but who would be thinking to break into a senator's house? And what are they going to take before somebody sees them? My frustration mounted at this passive refusal to simply follow orders. Everything was always tied together in a slave household. Gideon wasn't just questioning the wisdom of my orders. He wanted to know for the sake of what punishment would happen if he failed. He wanted to know if this was coming from Clarence or Gertrude. A voice from behind me called out, "Yes, Gideon, your mistress wonders the same thing. Who are you expecting, Camilla?" It was Gertrude. She had been hiding behind me and listening, planning to undermine me in front of the slaves as she always did. What had I done to her? That's what I would like to know. Tolerated her criticisms and her brutish lessons on slavery. Cried my nights alone while her son was off trying to start a rebellion. I didn't even get to name Daniel. She just chose it and scrawled it on a tomb that she left on that miserable island. I realized in that moment I hated Gertrude. I explained. No one. I'm just concerned with all these strangers in town. Charleston has been a hotbed for weeks, and you have never said a word, mused Gertrude. You're not expecting anyone from up north, are you? No, I said. There was no telling who or what the thief was like in the real world. He could be a slave for all I knew. The figure I saw in the dream world had certainly been a man, but the creatures trailing behind him on that long golden chain made me shudder. Not knowing what else to do, I abruptly turned and headed back into the house. I distinctly heard Gertrude warning Gideon that he was to report anything I said to her as I left. None of them trusted me. It was clear I was on my own if I wanted to ever reunite with my Daniel. I went up to my room and checked the jar. I decided the only way to be certain the jar was safe was to keep it on my own person. I experimentally picked it up, careful to keep the lid on so I did not repeat the last sojourn, but found it too cold. I wrapped it in cloth, but then it was too cumbersome. Eventually, I opted to tie a sheet around me in the style of how slaves carry their children. I experimented with different folds and creases until it was growing late. I went to my window to ask Daniel how I looked just as the gas lights along the battery were being lit. My heart froze when I looked down and saw a man standing under the lamplight. It was dark enough that I could not see his face, but I could tell he was staring directly at me. I could feel his eyes on me. I whispered for Daniel to please come, that he was here, and I was frightened, and no one believed me. There was no answer. With complete and utter certainty, I realized I had to run. Out the back, past the carriage house, I would go until I found Clarence at the Secession Congress. It was nearing 7 o'clock, so surely he would be done soon. I cannot explain my reasoning any better, sister. My mind felt such compulsions, such absolute thrusts of impulse, that I could not resist it without going mad. As I went down the stairs, I heard Gertrude call my name, but I paid her no heed. Bila, too, began calling for me as I ran out the back door, past the carriage house with the little gate that connected to the alley meant for slaves and servants to use. 2 slaves were standing with baskets of food to be delivered when I entered. I could only see a fraction of their stock before I hurried by. Out of the alley, I emerged onto East Bay Street and began to push through the throngs of slaves as they hurried about their tasks before the curfew drum beat and called them all home. I turned, but I could see nothing in the crowd, yet my fear did not abate. Turning off East Bay onto Broad, I made my way to St. Andrew's Hall. Outside, a throng of white people had gathered, and the whole area was lit up with torches. It seemed like all the mobs that had paraded these past few days were gathered outside to hear what was announced. On the steps of the hall, lined with white columns, was Clarence, William Barnwell Rhett, and many other delegates. The crowd called for news, and Rhett shouted, "We're a Commonwealth now, boys! The Palmetto Republic has been born this day!"
Cheers went out so loud that I felt blasted by the force. Fireworks were lit and people began to dance in the street. I pressed deeper into the mass of bodies, pleading for them to let me through, but it was all chaos. I felt a hand briefly on my shoulder, but it could have been anyone. Another time I was jostled so badly that I stumbled, and someone shouted to take care, for there was a lady present. When I regained my composure, the crowd was beginning to spread so that they might wake the whole town with their news. Slaves scurried out of the way as the mob gained momentum. Clarence stood on the hall steps with his fellow politicians, beaming with pride at this accomplishment. I finally managed to push through, and when he saw me, the look on his face was pure horror. I thought he might at least be a little happy that I wanted to be present for this historic moment, but then I remembered the frozen jar around my waist and realized how this all must appear. To him, I was simply a bereaved mother who could not forget her lost babe. "Camilla, you must not be out. The excitement will be terrible for you in this condition," said Clarence. He looked around hastily to see how many people had noticed. "We must fetch you a doctor at once. Mother was right. You have a serious illness, and it cannot be ignored any longer." "Doctor?" I asked, having no clue to what he referred. "Yes, dear. You are not well. There are hospitals that can take care of you." I shook my head and did not let him cloud my mind. I had too clear a vision of the danger to let Clarence distract me. I scanned the crowd until I saw the thief, and sure enough, there he was. As the last of the great mob paraded into Charleston to celebrate their secession from the Union, there stood a lone white man staring at the little bundle tied around my body. "I am not sick! Look, do you see that man?" I screamed, pointing across Broad Street. The delegates around Clarence were all looking now. At first, Clarence did not heed me, instead taking my arm and patting it reassuringly. Then he followed my pointing hand and saw the figure who was now approaching us. Clarence seemed about to speak, then he gasped. His grip on my arm went slack, and he took a stumbling step forward as the man raised his arms in greeting. "My God, it's Uncle Armitage!"
Cthulhu in the Deep South. By Kirk Battle. Read by Toby Nelson. Chapter 7.
The man my husband called Uncle nodded at the recognition, clearly a little surprised that anyone should know him after being gone so long. The reunion seemed to hold little joy for Clarence. His entire inheritance in Charleston came about because of this uncle's disappearance. Even his rise to political power was because of the presumption that Richard Armitage was dead. I quickly moved behind Clarence because I knew this man's true nature, but I was grateful that he posed a threat to Clarence as well. It would save me the trouble of explaining anything. "You must be," said the uncle. He was attempting a mollifying smile. We were all staring at him, recognition blooming across the elite of Charleston. "Where in God's name have you been? You disappeared with your daughter years ago. Where is she?" asked Robert Barnwell Rhett, coming up from behind us. I am afraid," said Armitage, with a genuine look of sadness crossing his face. "My daughter passed away during our travels. We went abroad and then elsewhere." "Never a letter? No obituary? You realize your nephew here has inherited the lot of it, don't you?" shouted Rhett, clearly agitated. "Why come back? Are you a spy sent from the north?" Clarence was not speaking, his jaw working and his hands clenching and unclenching. My poor husband must have been deciphering the portent of all this. Did Richard want his wealth back? Or was it as Rhett said, and he meant to use Clarence for something more sinister? I deeply wanted to get away, so I whispered, "My love, he was following me here. I grew afraid and came to you." "Following?" asked Clarence. "At breakfast you mentioned something, but how could you have known?" Rhett was moving closer while the uncle shrank away. He did not seem to want anyone to get close. After a few more steps, Rhett looked down Broad Street and saw the fireworks blazing all the way down the peninsula. "I've got to get to my newspaper and ready the press for the headlines. I'll leave the family reunion to you, but do not forget the matter we discussed earlier, Clarence. Something must be done about these forts, and soon." He meant Fort Sumter and Fort Moultrie out in the Channel, one almost completed and the other occupied by a full garrison of federal troops. The cannons were meant for any enemy of the United States, and that term could now potentially apply to the Palmetto Republic. "I can assure you, nephew, that I have no desire to retrieve my lands or houses, if that is what you are concerned about. I left something behind in my home that is most precious to me. A simple trinket, one that I would be very surprised if you were even aware of. If I can but retrieve it, I shall be on my way again as quickly as possible." This gave Clarence pause, and I grew alarmed that he would listen to such talk. Of course, the thief meant the keystone around my neck. I pulled at Clarence and whispered again that I wanted to go home and that this man was following me. Clarence only looked at the bag tied around me in the style of how slaves carry their babies and shook his head sadly. "I must apologize for my wife. She has not been well lately. I can tell you of it later, perhaps when you tell me where you have been all these years. But even if that was not all you seek, I cannot deny my own family Southern hospitality. Please come with me back to the Battery, and we will have something to celebrate our new republic." And so they set off in the dark streets towards home, Clarence occasionally turning to cluck at me like some wayward dog. It made me furious to see how quickly he did not take my side. I wanted to show him just how absurd this foul being was. I wanted to throw the keystone into the channel so we could all watch him dive after it. Clarence seemed to relax as they walked, the news that his uncle was not here to dispute the inheritance lightening the mood considerably. "Why, uncle, you have aged remarkably well. Even your hair is the same color. You are just as I remember you when I was a little boy." "Thank you. Travel has suited me," murmured Richard Armitage. "I remember our visits to Ryland so well. Mother complained about how busy you were, but Father always said you were a man of business and did not have time for small affairs. I have done my best to follow that ideal with your property. I hope you will be pleased." "Yes, good, splendid," said the uncle. He glanced at me, eyeing the frozen jar before giving me a penetrating look. We returned to the house as Gertrude walked onto the porch. She looked ready to scold me like some wayward child as Gideon and Bila followed behind. I could see marks on both their arms where Gertrude must have administered punishment with her wooden spoon. It pained me to see someone hurt on my account. The thief was here, but where was Daniel? What was I supposed to do next? Gertrude did not seem to notice Armitage at first. "Clarence, I cannot be held accountable for her any longer. She escaped, yes, escaped, fleeing with her makeshift baby like some runaway slave. We must send her to the... Oh, my God!" Uncle Armitage smiled and bowed graciously before extending his hand in the proper fashion of a gentleman. Gertrude took it for a moment before she yanked the hand close, then looked into the man's face more closely. She gasped in horror. "You can't! It cannot be! You have not aged a day! Clarence, this is not your uncle, but some impostor!" "Mother, be calm. He is not here to dispute my inheritance, only to seek some trinket. He's a spy! Look at him. Why, he can't be any older than the day he left all those years ago," said Gertrude. Then she shouted, "Spy!" louder, and turned to call for help from the crowds thronging the Battery. In such close proximity to the lights of the house, it was much clearer that the man was only middle-aged, not the old man he should have been. Gertrude managed to attract the attention of several people. The man claiming to be Richard Armitage took one look around, then lurched forward for the frozen jar still hanging around my waist. I screamed and began clawing at his hands while my husband grabbed him about the neck. "Stop this! At once! She is not well!" shouted Clarence. The group Gertrude was attracting rushed forward and began to try to stop the uncle as I screamed and clung to the frozen jar with all my might. The thief finally relented and broke free, looking about wildly for some means of escape. He seemed as if he was about to jump into the channel when the mob surrounded him. Kicking and screaming, they grabbed him by the arms and began dragging him to the city jail. "Good heavens, what is going on?" murmured Clarence, panting and out of breath. "Are you all right, my love?" My arms were beginning to burn from holding the cold jar so close, and I finally loosened my grip. I don't think anyone quite connected that there was something in the blanket's folds. I turned the jar aside so Clarence would not feel it as he embraced me and checked me over, finally kissing my forehead. "Damn spies. They're everywhere, I tell you," muttered Gertrude. "No doubt he wanted to take Camilla hostage and try to force some kind of settlement over secession." Clarence sighed. "Mother, I hardly think it likely Lincoln and his ilk are sending kidnappers. This will be resolved with diplomacy." My mother-in-law gave him that piteous, vile look she would give me whenever I was only half-heartedly disciplining the slaves in the household. "Son, mark my words. This secession is going to be resolved with violence." It was only a few days later that we received the news. I had been feeling better and trying to take my meals with the rest of the house now that Clarence was home again. The jar was safely tucked away in my dresser. There was no sign of Daniel, and I did miss my baby, but what had once seemed so absolutely pressing seemed to relent in my mind now that the uncle was in shackles. A slave, well-dressed and mannered in the way of only the most trusted servants, entered and presented a message to Clarence. He was about to open it when the messenger, eyeing Bila, suggested that Clarence read it in private. My husband left for the library, but soon returned, pale and more than a little frantic. "Soldiers are occupying Fort Sumter," said Clarence quietly. Gertrude dropped her fork and cried out in panic. "But I thought it was not completed," I asked. "Finished enough for them to have guns and supplies to last them months," said Clarence. "Oh, that tyrant Lincoln has not even been sworn in, yet here he is already making ready for war against us?" "Now, Mother, this is a delicate situation. Fort Sumter was always United States property," explained Clarence. "This will all be resolved with negotiations, you shall see." "How can we be diplomatic when our neighbors' guns are bearing down on us?" asked Gertrude. "Mother, please, you're upsetting Camilla," said Clarence. "She's doing so well despite that awful incident with that man." "What did the rest of the letter say?" I asked, trying to seem calm. "It is best if I do not say," explained Clarence. "But I must go soon. The governor has called a meeting in a secret location. Take care, both of you." Clarence left, and once again I found myself dining alone with Gertrude. She had gotten into a habit of pretending I was not in the room, like I was some sort of ghostly apparition that she need only look away from in order not to be affected. Once I had walked in on her and Clarence discussing a hospital for me, but I was relieved to hear my husband still defending me. He said I was getting better, and that he wished Gertrude would support me. Such moments are part of why I still love him so. After we both finished our meals, Gertrude rang the bell to summon Bila to clear our plates. 1, 4, then 10 minutes went by, and yet we still waited awkwardly together. When it seemed clear Gertrude was about to launch into one of her tirades about finding good slaves, I excused myself and went upstairs. To my shock, when I entered my room, I found Byla standing by my dresser. I immediately thought of the frozen jar and shouted in alarm. Byla shrank to the far wall by the window when she heard me, hands shaking in terror. I saw that she had found the jar and opened it. The water was no longer frozen, and there was a glimmer of something inside. No doubt she was having just as much trouble picking it up as I did. "You have no business going through my things," I said. "Please, missus, that thing is poison. You got to get rid of it." "It is my property and very dear to me, and you are not to touch it. Why, that spy just the other day was trying to steal it, and now I have to worry about my own slaves coming after my things." Byla's eyes watered, and she trembled all over. "I can't sleep with it in the house. Gideon won't even come around. Why did you go there? What devil made you fetch it from that oak tree?" It struck a chord to hear her describe my Daniel as a devil. A cold pit formed in my stomach as I wondered how she might know. Did the dream walker visit her too? I strode to the wall where Byla cowered while trying to contain my fear. I did not know what I might do, but before I could quite contain myself, I reached over and pinched her. Hard. Skin twisted, and I heard Byla start screaming in a high wail. She pulled away, and I found myself dizzy all of a sudden, like some force had been holding me up, and now it was finished. As the fear and anger left me, I seemed to deflate. "What is the meaning of this?" asked Gertrude, standing in the doorway. "I can't stand it any more, Miss Gertrude, I can't. I'd rather be out in the cotton field than with this woman," said Byla, dashing out. I stumbled over to the bed in a daze. This was the first moment I truly began to wonder if something was wrong with me. I did not pay any heed to Gertrude as she strode across the room. Instead, I was looking out the window, wishing for privacy so I might speak with Daniel again for guidance. It had been so long since we visited with one another in dreams. I wanted to stand under the oak tree at Carcosa just as we used to and play with my baby. The slap came hard, followed by another one that was even harder. I was so shocked that I made no sound, my mouth hanging open in surprise. Gertrude's face filled my vision and blocked all sight of Ryland and Carcosa. "Stop staring out that window this instant! Your baby is dead, and there is nothing on that island except mosquitoes and tombstones. You may have tricked my son into marrying you because he's a fool when it comes to women and always has been," said Gertrude, staring into my eyes with such fury that I could scarcely guess what she might do next. "You are not going to destroy his future, do you understand me? I don't care if you thought being a wealthy planter's wife was going to be some fairy tale dream, or if you were a damned abolitionist from the very beginning, but you are not dragging the Armitage family to ruin with your madness. You are in the deep South now, and you had better start acting like a proper lady. No more frightening the slaves with your strange behavior, no more rowing trips out to the islands." I could only stare at the floor. Before that moment I had only felt alone, now I felt something far worse in my own house. I felt unwanted. "Unlike you, I'm a proper Southern lady, and I know everything that goes on in my household. I did not intend to say anything about your little trip out to Carcosa, except to forbid Gideon from ever taking you out there again. I don't care if you picked up some ghastly memento. We cannot risk slaves running away now. How would we get them back if they made it all the way to the north? Whatever it is you picked up must be thrown away, and you must do it where the slaves can see." My shock was finally giving way to anger as I realized this was truly all that Gertrude cared about. Just herself, the family and their precious property. I had struggled to recover from the loss of my son for so long, but now I could see there was no care at all for my lost child. No support. No family to be found among these people except when it suited them. Without thinking, I cried out and shoved Gertrude away from me. "You will never touch me again, you witch!" Now it was Gertrude's turn to be shocked. "I am not your slave." We stared at each other in icy fury before my mother-in-law spun and stormed out of the room. The door slammed behind her with a deafening crash, and I was alone. My eyes were pulled toward the window, to the lonely sight of Carcosa and Ryland, but I felt too aware of that retreat now. I had been drifting in dreams for so long that I lacked much connection with the waking world. Surely Daniel had everything he needed now. The thief was in shackles down the road at the jail. Perhaps if I went to speak with him, he would make good on his promise to reunite with me. Then all would be well, and this cruel place would not be so bad. I opened the jar and let my fingers dance upon the surface. I kept my eyes focused on the sea, the wide-ranging waves, the way the room smelled of wood and kerosene from my little lamp, and felt the raw sting on my cheek from Gertrude's slap. Then I began to dream-walk as I had seen Daniel do before, miming the actions in my heart. The waves far across the channel seemed to rise and darken as my hand lingered over the icy-cold jar. There was a sinking sensation. Then I felt my body slumped to the ground. I blinked once, twice, and then I was standing on the white shores. A loud beat, and I knew the black void was now discernible in the far starry sky. I knew with certainty that I could dream-walk on my own. I first walked to the great oak at Carcosa, but no one was present. I then focused on the feeling of Daniel and sensed a path across the black sea. As I walked, the sky twisted and blended with the waves, surging with cognition before I found myself stumbling into a cold, dark room. The place was enormous, so large you could fit an entire city inside of it. And above I saw a great domed ceiling of gray marble so high there were clouds in the air. I could hear voices before I saw anyone. One of them was distinctly Daniel, and I walked in that direction. Soon, as one sees an object far in the distance that draws steadily closer, I came upon Daniel and the thief. All the gold rope and bodies were bound up in a pillar, and at the top lay the man I had seen on the night of secession. They all squirmed and writhed in pain while Daniel stood before them. "After all these years, Yith, I have finally caught you. Compared to your compatriots, you were the most difficult to trap. My master will be very pleased." The man on the pillar said something in a harsh, guttural language that made no sense to me. There was a pleading, earnest tone to the way this Armitage spoke that made some tiny bit of pity rise in my heart. Even when he had leapt for me back in Charleston, I had sensed he meant me no harm. He only wanted the keystone. The thing I once thought of as Daniel laughed and kicked at the pillar. All the bodies seemed bound in agony, as what happened to one happened to all. The woman? No, she is just a weak-willed human. I knew you would sense one of our own, but it occurred to me, if a mere human seemed to stumble on the keystone, then you might be foolish enough to try something. Her own people provided the rest of the trap with their little rebellion. My heart sank, and I clutched at my sides. To hear this revelation was a far worse blow than anything Gertrude could have done. I sank to the ground and began to long for death so that there might be an end to my foolish mistakes. I wanted my mad dreams and waking nightmare to just crash over my head in one final cursed absolution. Despite how much it hurt, I could not stop longing for the baby. And in my heart I could still feel something. I let the dream carry me away as one might let a river drag them underneath. The gray dome faded and the world spun until white shores again swelled underneath me. As I sank into fragments of dream, beyond Carcosa and deep into the inky black night, I could hear a baby crying. I awoke certain of one thing. My child was still out there.
Cthulhu in the Deep South. Kirk Battle. Read by Toby Nelson. Chapter 8.
The moment I heard that child's cries, I knew I could not give up until I found my son. In the waking world, Gertrude began to talk openly of asylums, while Clarence still refused to hear any word of it. The slaves avoided me at all costs. I pretended ignorance to all of this, and since my husband was as absent as ever now that Fort Sumter was occupied by federal troops, there was nothing my hateful mother-in-law could do about me. For the first few weeks of 1861, Clarence and the new secessionist government wrote letters to Washington, imploring them to order Fort Sumter abandoned and let it be given over to their new Palmetto Republic. Meanwhile, the other southern states were rallying behind the call for secession, and a newly formed confederation of independent states was being forged. Clarence would often talk of the founding fathers in those days and write flowery letters with language copied from Thomas Jefferson and John Locke. The hope was that President Buchanan might take some action for peace before Lincoln was sworn in that March. Nobody used the word siege to describe Fort Sumter, yet it was always implied. The men in the fort were cut off from all supplies except their mail, and that was being thoroughly read by the Vigilance Committee before being handed over. With the help of the Keystone, I spent those days ranging across the dream world in search of the little voice. I no longer cared if people thought me mad. Gertrude seemed to almost encourage my seclusion in the hope that it would lead to some new illness. All she could detect was that I lay in bed for hours on end. As Clarence worked for the resolution of Fort Sumter with his diplomatic siege, Gertrude waited for me to die so she might find a better, more southern wife for her son. But I will show her just how good a wife I truly am, soon. After weeks of searching, I began to eavesdrop more on the impostor and his interrogations of the thief. Both would speak in languages I did not understand, but there were still the occasional lapses into English. The thief was a refugee of some sort, escaping from the perfect ending that this Cthulhu creature desired. An ending to end not just one life, but all life. And somehow this strange being called Yith had disrupted that perfection. I soon realized he might be a useful ally in my searches for my son. The thief was tied to his pillar of golden-chained bodies in the dream world, and I could not draw near there. Yet in the waking world, where I now so rarely dwelled, he was still trapped in the dungeons of Charleston. The man everyone assumed was a Yankee spy was held in the old jail up King Street, where they used to keep pirates and foreign buccaneers. It was a squat stone amalgamation of iron bars and granite that was purposefully below sea level. At high tide, water would creep in under the foundations, so that prisoners were often damp and walking in a shallow pool of murky water. It stank of mold and rotting earth for a block away in any direction. Few prisoners survived a winter there, but this spy weathered the cell with remarkable aplomb. Despite the terrible conditions and poor food, he seemed to have no trouble with his environment, still looking as healthy as ever. My first attempt to see the thief was done under the guise of charity. I packed a basket of food and walked to the dungeon ready to plead innocence if I was questioned. 2 cadets from the Citadel Military School stood at their posts in perfect boredom. They were happy to pass the time with a lady, but when I asked to go inside to see the prisoner and myself, they refused. They were under strict orders from the new South Carolina government, but were also more than happy to take my basket to him. They left me no choice, and no doubt they helped themselves to the marmalade and other treats inside. I would have to find some other way. The days passed, and there was still no resolution to the soldiers at Fort Sumter. When March arrived and Lincoln was sworn into office, Clarence dropped into complete despair. President Lincoln announced that a ship would be sailing into the Channel to resupply the officers with food and water, and that any hostile action would be seen as an act of war from the new republic. Robert Barnwell Rhett and the other fire-eating secessionists launched into a furious tirade of accusations and calls for the men of South Carolina to arm themselves. A general was sent by the newly formed Confederate government, and the other forts in the Channel were armed with men and cannon. Everyone was on edge in Charleston now. No more marches or parades. No more politicians shouting on boxes for the South to rise up. All was quiet as the impending crisis tumbled toward the climax Gertrude had predicted. Violence. It happened in April, during the darkest hours just before dawn. I was walking across the dark seas of the dream world, looking for my son, when a series of explosions sent ripples so large that I could detect them across realities. When I awoke, cannon fire was booming from the far end of the battery. South Carolina's cannons were firing upon Fort Sumter and the little squadron manning her parapets. Everyone began pouring out on the streets, white and black, to watch the ominous beginning of the war. I knew instantly that this was my chance. I threw on my clothes and tucked the jar holding the keystone into a basket. Smoke filled the air now, and everything stank of gunpowder. Clarence was standing in his evening clothes and had thrown a jacket over them, now staring mutely out at the dismal failure of his diplomacy. Gertrude was wrapped in a shawl and had a grim look of satisfaction at being right, despite the horrible results it would bring about. Bila and Gideon betrayed no emotion, but only looked at the fiery explosions, transfixed as the cannons tore apart the starry sky. No one noticed as I slipped by and made my way up Broad Street to the old decrepit dungeon. The cadets were away from their posts, watching the glorious start of the war so many wished for so fervently. I did not need the keys, for I only wished to speak with the prisoner, and so I let myself inside by the simple wooden door. The inside reeked of brackish water and spoiled food. The thief was sitting cross-legged on a wooden box above the water, eyes closed and twitching slightly with each cannon blast. I worried that he might not be alert, and instead wandering the dream world, but I could tell he was listening. Even this strange creature was awake for the guns as they fired on Fort Sumter. "Are you here to finish me?" he asked. Cool and collected, he did not open his eyes. I bit my lip, not wanting to reveal ignorance. There was so much I did not know, but this man had to reveal it all to me. I hefted the keystone, and his eyes flew open immediately. "What is it?" I asked, not wanting him to know my true purpose just yet. Outside, another round of cannon fire roared out over the battery. "So you're not from the cult?" Now I remember. The Dreamwalker said he had ensnared a human to do his bidding, and here you are. "What is it?" I said again, as I approached with the keystone. He seemed reluctant for me to hold the item too close. A key without a door, but one that can still lock many things for the right person. Can it get me back my son?" I asked as the cannons boomed louder. I knew there would not be too much time before the guards returned, so I decided to dispense with any more probing. Armitage looked confused by this request, and so I rushed to explain my story. Losing my child out on Ryland, first seeing him out on Carcosa and then hearing his cries. The little boy I met under the oak tree, and how he proved to be an impostor. "Was it all a lie?" I asked about Daniel. "A mother's knowledge, a mother's instinct, it cannot have been wrong." There was genuine pity on the thief's face. "No, that was real enough. I suspect he snatched your child as he crossed into the waking world of your womb, back when you lived so close to Carcosa. After that, it was just a matter of making sure you fetched the keystone, and that I was foolish enough to go for it. Your child is gone in this world." "Then why can I hear his cries?" "I said it was gone in this world. He may still be alive in the dream world." My mind raced at this news. I tried to think of what to ask next when I heard the sound of the guards cheering and whooping. They were coming back to the dungeon. I only had a few more moments before they would detect someone was inside. The guards paused and burst into song as the cannons boomed so loud I thought my ears might go deaf. "Please, is there nothing that can be done for him?" I asked, tears welling up in my eyes. The thief regarded me coolly for a few more moments before closing his eyes. He would be almost a speck of light by now, the merest hint of existence in the vast tides and ebbs of dream. You would need to never leave his side and hold him close. I do not care for the waking world anymore. I would gladly leave this cruel place with its wars and violence. Perhaps we can come to a mutual exchange then. That keystone causes me great trouble, and you would be doing me a wondrous favor if you would cast it into the largest fire you can build. But without it I cannot dream walk. True. But if you were to die holding the keystone, your spirit would be sent to the dream world forever. You must already be quite adept at traveling betwixt dreams to know so much. That is the exchange I ask. To save your son, you must destroy yourself. And if you do, why not have your revenge on those who have tricked you so horribly and stole your child? Destroy that keystone along with yourself, and you will do far more damage than you can conceive. Thus, the true horror of what he proposed was laid bare. I made no reply, only felt more cold than even the frozen object which I carried. For as much as I was repulsed by what this creature offered, my heart did not reject it immediately. When I stepped outside the dungeon, both guards were still staring across the battery, and I sneaked away while the cannons boomed and rattled the holy city. Please believe me, sister. I put away the thief's suggestions as too gruesome initially. After a few days of firing, Fort Sumter fell, and for a brief time everyone thought that might be the end of it. More states left the Union, and a stable government formed in Virginia's capital. Clarence had made all the right connections since he had proven he was willing to sacrifice everything for his state. He was sent as one of South Carolina's representatives, and for those first few months I again retreated to my room. I would find another way. Yet the dream world yielded nothing despite all my walking. I ranged over mountains and streams for any sight of the child, but found no light. I met creatures and saw wondrous cities of towers so big they could not possibly be built by human beings. I rowed ships across black seas where people with red eyes leered at every newcomer. I searched, but it was all in vain. My body in the waking world grew so tired that I developed chills and fevers, so that I took ill and would often have to go days without being able to dress. I made sure to keep the keystone close just in case I expired. The news for the war was good at first. In July there was a great victory at Bull Run, which I dare say not even Gertrude expected. The newspapers declared the cause of the Confederacy just and godly, that the Yankees were clearly doomed, and every household toasted the defeat of the tyrant Lincoln at long last. At night I could hear the clatter of parties drifting over the channel from every quarter of the city. I was considered an invalid by this point. Success could not last. In August, the Union sent a fleet that began capturing the outer islands along the Carolina coasts with utter ease. The Confederacy did not have the soldiers to mount a defense by land and sea, and so the barrier islands fell to enemy hands. In November of 1861, Port Royal was lost, and suddenly the Yankees were no longer an abstract foe for someone else to handle, but a very real, very armed force. Their steamships could be seen moving up and down the coast daily, and were far too numerous for the few ships of Charleston to attack. General Beauregard managed the defenses with great efficiency, and he commandeered the island of Ryland for the defense of the city. I watched with vague interest as they erected a new fort where my son's body lay. Refugees began to stream into the city as the cold chill of autumn gave way to winter. The once merry parades were replaced with streams of dazed whites and slaves whose homes were taken with barely any fight at all. Gertrude and the others began to shift from screening the mail and looking for spies to simply trying to provide enough food for everyone to eat. Clarence returned from the Confederate Congress to find his Charleston much changed from when he left months earlier. It was all over in December. There was a light knock on my door, and once again Clarence entered with that expression of worry on his face. I was laid out in bed, and the knock had pulled me away from my dreaming. He sat at the foot, not close enough for me to touch him, and he did not look me in the eye. "My love, I have spoken with Mother at great length, and made a decision. I have begun to make preparations for you to go someplace safe. It is a hospital in Greenville that will be far away from the war and the days that are to come." The word hospital alarmed me immediately. If I was separated from the Keystone, I would not be able to continue my searching. Do you think that's really necessary? I'm ever so comfortable here." "Camilla, all day you lay in bed next to that jar. If you aren't lying there, then you stare out the window toward Ryland and our... Well, let us not dwell on it any longer. You have done enough of that for both of us. Mother says I must live in the world as it is, and that means accepting that you are not well. That was who was behind all of this. Gertrude planned to be rid of me once and for all. I thought to argue again, but my husband would not even look at me. The wedge between us was too wide now. The days and weeks of our not seeing one another as large as the black void that boomed in the dream world. Yet, sister, I still loved him with all my heart because I knew how much it hurt him to do this. I knew that I had to find a way for us to be together without Gertrude's interference. That was when the decision came. I feigned depression and asked Clarence if I might request a few things of Byla. He looked relieved to leave the room. When she came, I asked her to buy me a blank book and writing materials. I then asked Gertrude if she might go ahead to Greenville with some of my things for the hospital. The foul witch was only too eager to agree. She is gone now, and there is only Clarence in the house. I have spent the past few days writing this record, pausing only to watch the refugees of this war as they wander the battery in a daze. On their faces I see the same shocked question over and over. How could this happen to me? I have asked that same question ever since I came to the Deep South. I have shouted it in the waking world and the dreaming one. There is no answer. I intend to hand this record to Byla and send all the slaves away for the night. She will have strict instructions to mail it to you in secret. Then I shall put my plan into motion. A large household like ours has plenty of lamp oil, and I shall pour it into every vacant room. Then I shall go from room to room, lighting the way with a candle until I come to Clarence's room, and then I will enter and lock the door. I shall go into bed and lie with him as a good wife should while I keep the keystone close. The flames will rise and we shall burn, and the keystone will burn, and then we can be a family again. We will go to the dream world together and be with my son just as we should have been. Goodbye, dear sister.